The life of Joseph, like what we've looked at so far, is a familiar one. Joseph is born to his father in his old age, as we just read, and is immediately favored above his brothers, which one might think is a good thing. You know, being your parents' favorite child would have some perks to it. As I prepped for this message, I thought, I bet every person who came from a family of more than one kid thinks that their parent had a favorite. But I've noticed, working with teens and talking with my brother, that every kid thinks it's the other one. That no matter, you know, there is never the kid that thinks, oh, it was me. They all think, oh, it was my brother. For instance, if you asked Bo, he would tell you that I was the baby and got away with everything. I'm not sure why he thinks that. I didn't get away, in my mind, with much at all. I won't say I didn't get away with anything, but I didn't get away with everything for sure. I know he would say that because I've heard him say that. But then on the other hand, if you asked me, I don't know that I would say Bo was a favorite, but being the oldest, he definitely got perks that as the youngest I didn't. For instance, my brother always wanted to wear, the cowboy boots and cowboy hats and such, so that's what was bought. At least as a kid, this is how I envisioned it. That's what was bought because that's what Bo wanted, which meant I wore cowboy boots and cowboy hat because it's what got handed down to me. So I wouldn't say favorite, but being the oldest, he got what he wanted, or at least that's how I perceived it. And I only remember that specific example because I got an attitude about it one time, and I stressed one time because I didn't want to wear cowboy boots and hat and got in a lot of trouble for that attitude. So one time I did that. But being a favorite like Joseph would have had, in theory at least, some advantages to it. You'd get the nicest things, which we see. Joseph is given a coat of many colors. You notice we don't see that for his brothers. They didn't get that. In fact, the coat must have been something that they were all jealous of because it was the coat that he was given that made his brothers see that he was loved more. Being the favorite, you'd get kind of the nicest things, or maybe you'd get special treatment. Your parents are harder on the others than they are on yourself. They expect the brothers to go out and do more, but the favorite doesn't have to. There are some advantages to it. But being Dad's favorite, while it may in theory seem like a good thing, brought some serious issues with it. The biggest being the issues between he and his brothers. I'm just going to real quickly read 3 verses. Verse 4, and when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. Skip down verse 11. His brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying. Verse 18, and when they saw him afar off, even before he came near to them, unto them, they conspired against him to slay him. This is a real problem. Sure, Dad loves you over the rest, but he can only protect you to a point. And if you notice in those verses, the issue between Joseph and his brothers grew. It grew. It started as his brothers hated him and couldn't speak peaceably to him. They saw that Dad loved him more, and and because of that, it caused them to hate Joseph. That's starting off pretty strong. When your brothers can't speak peaceably to you and the Bible says they hate you, that's starting off pretty strong. I try not to often, at least, use the word hate because someone told me what it meant. And I used to be one who I was quick to, I hate traffic and I hate what that person said to me. I hate them for what they did. And not really meaning it, just throwing a dumb word out there. And I had someone finally say, do you know what that means? I don't know. It means I don't like it, right? And they explained to me the word hate means, and they showed me this as well, but that the word hate means to wish that they had never been born. And while, yes, I do wish that traffic had never been born, there are a lot of other things that as Christians we shouldn't be saying we wish weren't alive. But that's exactly what Joseph's brothers are doing here. Their dad prefers Joseph and they hate him for it. They wished he hadn't been born. But then it continues to grow. It's not like it just stopped there. It continues to grow. They go from hating him, wishing he hadn't been born, to envying him. It's what we saw in verse 11, because now not only is he our father's favorite, but he must also be God's favorite because he's having dreams from God, and those dreams say he's going to rule over us. And while they all got mad about it, being Dad's favorite, if Dad gave his blessing to Joseph, they all knew it was possible. I mean, in those days, if Dad said, "You're going to serve your brother," you served your brother. Being Dad's favorite, they knew this was a possibility. And I guarantee that's what this envy is them saying, "I want that for me. I want to be Dad's favorite. I want to be the heir that leads this family someday. I want Dad's blessing. I want rule over my brothers." It's no longer just, "I wish he wasn't here," but it's grown to, "I want to be in his position." Then it grows way further on to where they're plotting his death. Verse 18, we looked at that. They're conspiring against him, conspiring to slay him. They all get together, and I can see they all hate him. They all want to be in that position. Well, the easiest way for that to happen, and this is a bit of a flawed plan, because the easiest for that to happen is to get rid of him, except there's still a lot of brothers. It's not like you're automatically in this thing, but this has grown all the way from he's Dad's favorite and we hate him to we'll just kill him and end this. And as we know from the passage, it goes from this to what for tonight's message, I'm just going to kind of put it as it went from this to just a series of terrible events in Joseph's life. And yet, God was with Joseph through it all. Through things that we would look at and think, boy, this was just awful, God was with him. So tonight what I want us to do is look at 4 major events that happened in the life of Joseph after this point, and see God in these terrible events of his life. The first is, I want to see God in the pit. Look at verse 19 and verse 19 through 21. It says, "And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit. And we will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him." The brothers have all conspired to slay him, and now here's their chance. Dad has sent little brother to come check on us in the field. We can kill him now. No one will know. We can, throw his body in the pit, tell Dad an animal got him. But God was with Joseph and worked through his brother Reuben. You have to remember, Reuben is just as mad as his brothers. He's part of them who are, one verse before, conspiring to slay Joseph. He hates Joseph just as much as the others. He's envied Joseph just like the other brothers have. He's conspired to kill him just like everyone else. This isn't that all of a sudden Reuben has a change of heart. It's not like he all of a sudden, that he's really a better guy than the rest of his brothers and he realized what they were doing. I've heard it said that, since he was the oldest, he was the most level-headed and thought better of it. And I don't believe that's it at all. I believe it's that God used Reuben. That happens, that God can use absolutely anyone that he wants to. There have been times that God's used some of the most unlikely people to do his work, and there have been times that God has used what we would deem as ungodly people to do his work. I believe that's exactly what's happening here in this passage, that not that Reuben had a change of heart or that he thought better about it, not that he cooled down a little bit about his anger, but that God got a hold of Reuben and used him. That God wasn't done with Joseph yet. God had things for him to do, and while this would have seemed like a terrible event, that's pretty terrible when you come to see your brothers and they capture you, rip off your coat, throw you in a pit. That's a pretty terrible thing. Can you imagine what must have been going through Joseph's mind? All the possibilities of what they might do to you. I don't know, maybe it's my imagination, but I have to think, that these brothers who are conspiring to slay him, as they capture him and are ripping off his coat, are discussing, how are we going to do this? Or discussing amongst themselves. Can you imagine how afraid you'd be if you've got a bunch of guys beating you up, taking your coat off you, and talking about how they're going to kill you? It's going to be a terrible event. Or maybe, worse, maybe they won't do anything. Maybe they're just going to throw you in a pit and leave you down there to die of thirst or starvation, whichever comes first. I have to think that all sorts of things were going through his mind, all the possibilities, while this was or would have been a terrible ordeal to go through, God was there. God delivered him from the hands of his brothers. God delivered him from whatever fate he might have faced in the pit. And while it doesn't sound great, God allowed him to be sold as a slave. And while I know that doesn't sound, like a great option, it's better than the alternative. God was with Joseph in the pit, and he delivered him. He protected him. Number 2, I want to see God in Potiphar's house. Turn over just a couple of chapters, chapter 39. Starting in verse 1, it says, "And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. He was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. And it came to pass, from the time that he made him overseer in the house, and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field." I don't know if you caught in there how many times it says, "and the Lord was with." Over and over and over and over. Now, I want to compartmentalize this just a little bit tonight, because we know the end of what happens, and we tend to read, because of that, we tend to read things like this knowing what will happen. But he went from being his father's favorite child to being thrown in a pit, to being sold as a slave, where he's drugged to Egypt, where he's forced into this guy's house. I mean, there's no nice way to put this. If this is happening, if this was your life and you don't know how this is going to turn out, this is terrible. I mean, he is ripped away from his home, ripped away from everything you know, from your family. You're forced to be a servant in Potiphar's house. If you didn't know how it all ended, it would be very easy to say, where is God in all this? Why is he allowing this to happen to me? But God hadn't left Joseph. Again, the verse that we just read, or the verses that we just read, repeatedly says that God was with him. And because God was with him in this situation, he was blessed. A couple of things to note in this. Joseph was blessed personally. You see that in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. Prosperous is not a word that's usually associated with a servant. And typically those things aren't used to describe the same person, but Joseph wasn't prosperous because he worked super hard. He wasn't prosperous because, the luck of the draw. He was prosperous because even in this, what would have been an awful, terrible situation, God was with him. The second thing to note is that others could see God with him. Verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. This is Potiphar. This is an Egyptian man. He's not a Christian. It's not like this is a man who's going to be looking for God working in Joseph's life. It's not like you buy a servant and you start watching him and say, I wonder if God's in this one. No, it's not what was happening here, but the way that Joseph lived in the middle of this whole situation showed that God was with him to those who were around him. Which really is, to myself at least, a very convicting thought, because it's really easy to have a good testimony when things are going well for you. And it's easy to live your life in a way that people can see that God's with you when everything is how you want. But things weren't exactly going Joseph's way. Most people would give Joseph a pass if he had a bad attitude, because we all would. But in the middle of this whole mess, he still lived in a way that God was seen in his life. God with Joseph in Potiphar's house made Joseph prosper, and it was seen by others. But also, God being with Joseph, it affected others. Verse 5, it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. Those around him were blessed because God was working in him. You think about it, Joseph could have very easily gotten a bad attitude and decided, I don't want to be here. It's not my fault I'm here. I'm not helping this guy. I'm not going to do it. I'm not happy I'm here. I don't like the people here. I shouldn't have to deal with this. I wish I was back home in my fancy coat. I don't want to be here. But he didn't. Joseph figured out a way, or figured out that God was with him and that he would bless him. God was with Joseph in the pit and delivered. God was with Joseph in Potiphar's house and blessed. Number 3, I want to see God in the prison. Turn over to chapter 39, still over to verse 20 and 21. It says, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Joseph, who, as we know, had done nothing wrong, but his master's wife lies about him. He's sent to prison. He's got to be feeling like every time I finally take a step forward, I get shoved 10 steps back. He keeps going through these things, and he keeps, God blesses, and he takes a step forward. Finally has things looking up in the middle of what is a bad situation. God's blessing, and he's prosperous, and his boss can see it and promotes him, and now his boss is prosperous. Things have to feel like, they're finally taking a turn in my direction, and now this. But even in prison, God's with Joseph. And God being with Joseph meant a couple of things. It meant that he was favored. Now, I've not been to prison, so I don't have, other than helping Brother Hohenstreet there, I don't go to prison as often as Brother Hohenstreet does. So I don't have tons of personal experience, but working in the fields I do, I have worked with plenty of guys who have spent way too much time there. And from talking to them, the difference between having a guard favor you and not is huge. Having a guard like you or not like you, makes a big difference, which makes sense. But God was with him, or because God was with him, he was favored. But even bigger than that, because God was with him, God provided a way out. The butler and the baker. We didn't read the passage. I'm not going to have us go through all that right now, but God provided a way for him to get out of the prison, because even in a series of low times, and this may have felt like the lowest because he was finally starting to get some progress, God had not abandoned him. God hadn't left him. God provided. So far we saw God in the pit delivered, God in Potiphar's house blessed, God in the prison provided. And then lastly tonight, I want to see God with Pharaoh. God with Pharaoh. Turn over chapter 41, verse 14. I'm going to kind of skip around just a little bit. Verse 14, it says, Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. I'm going to skip down to verse 38, and it says, And Pharaoh said unto his servant, Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, For as much as God has showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Joseph is now out of prison, tells Pharaoh what his dream means, and because of it is taken out of prison. God promotes him. God was with Joseph in Pharaoh's house. God was with him when he gives him the interpretation. Otherwise, you read, and I know we didn't read through the dream, but you read that dream from Pharaoh, and it makes no sense at all. If God didn't give him the interpretation, it makes no sense at all. Fat cows being eaten by skinny cows? Huh? I mean, that doesn't... I grew up on a farm. Cows aren't carnivores. Cows eating cows doesn't make sense by itself, even if you ignore the fat and the skinny part. What does that mean? And then If that's not confusing enough, now we have stalks of corn. Had God not given him the interpretation, it's no wonder that no one else could interpret the dream. It's no wonder that Pharaoh was waking up going, what did that mean? Because it makes no sense, but God gives the answer, Joseph. God was with him. God gives him position. It was because of the way that God provided, that he was placed in second in command of the nation. As the verse puts it, that only in the throne was he not above even Pharaoh. It's because how God provided that he was placed in second in command of the nation and put in a position that when his family needed to be saved from the famine, that he could. Had it not been for God, when that famine came, that wouldn't have been a possibility. When all this went on, his brothers hating him, wanting him dead, throwing him in a pit, selling him as a slave, being thrown in jail, brought before the Pharaoh, and everything else, when all this happened, God was there. Going through just what would have seemed like one after another, just attacks and terrible things happening, Joseph wasn't going through it alone. God was there. God protected him in the pit. He blessed him in Potiphar's house. He provided a way in the prison. God promoted him in Pharaoh's house. Now, here's what I want to do in conclusion. Let's apply this a little bit. Because I would venture to say that all of us have gone through phases of our life that we feel like things just keep going from bad to worse. We've all had those times where it just seems like, every time I start to get ahead, I get shoved back again. Don't despair, because God's there. Didn't really mean for that to rhyme, but it did, and that's pretty good. I might use that throughout this series. Seeing God everywhere, don't despair. God's there. In that terrible time, God will protect. That terrible time, God will provide. God will bless. God will promote. When faced with that terrible time, that time of why is this happening, look to God, because He's there. I'll use my terrible rhyme again. Don't despair. God's there. Let's pray.